Reading Chapter 11, The Escape from the American Dream 2. The full moon shone down on the great boats steaming through the icebergs. The crew of the American Dream 2 feasted well that night on a stew which, unbeknownst to them, was heavily laced with dragon nip. Hiccup had crept into the cooking tent and poured it into the bubbling cauldron of dinner. For a while, the hysterical crew ignored their spooky surroundings and sang out loud songs to the moon above, banging their dinner plates on the deck, and Norbert Nutjob fiddled madly on his vibrating violin, and the hysterics did wild jigs, and the polar serpents sat on their icebergs, quiet statues, only their eyes following the mayhem. And then, one by one, the dragon nip's heavy fumes overcame the hysterics. Sleep overtook them so quickly that they dropped as they stood in the middle of whatever they happened to be doing at the time, and fell to the deck in grotesque attitudes of some slumber. Norbert lay snoring, the violin still tucked under his chin. Goggle-eyed little Gory was clasped fondly to the breast of Ferociously Violent, who was under the sleepy delusion that he was 3 years old again, and this was his mother. Red Ronald was pedalling the wheels of the Keep the Boat from Sinking and Scare Away the Big Sea Creatures machine slower and slower, until he stopped entirely and drooped snoring over the handlebars. And the ship's cook collapsed face down in his snail and jellyfish pie. He would still be picking out bits of snail shell and egg out of his nostrils 3 days later. Hiccup, Kamikaze and Fishlegs waited until everybody in the deck was completely still, and then they waited 5 minutes more just to make sure. Then, slowly, they slipped down the rigging of the mask. Hiccup was carrying the sleeping Toothless in his breast pocket, and Kamikaze had the slumbering Stormfly draped round her shoulders like a scarf. They tiptoed across the deck of the American Dream 2, carefully picking their way through the sleeping, snoring warriors lying strewn on the boards, the sweet yellow-brown smoke from the cauldron blowing across the ship and making their eyes water. Cautiously, gently, Hiccup took the skiing thing from around Norbert's wrist and tied it back again to his own. Quietly, softly, Kamikaze removed the large bunch of keys from Norbert's waistband with her quick, light little fingers, and she opened the lock of the hatch that led down to the hole where they were holding the Wanderers. It took all 3 of them to lift up the hatch, which they did with a whining creak, and then they threw down a rope and the keys to the Wanderers below, Hiccup whispering as loud as he dared to tell them to unlock their chains and climb up one by one. The first 2 out were Bear Cub and his grandmother. Bear Cub was in a state of high excitement and danced round his grandmother, squeaking, I told you he would rescue us. You see, not all Vikings are wicked, and we're not doomed after all. Bear Cub's grandmother was torn between her delight at being rescued and her annoyance that her prophecy of doom wasn't being fulfilled. She sniffed. We're not rescued yet. If just one of those Vikings wakes up, we're all as dead as dinosaurs. Doomed, the lot of us. A one-way ticket to the happy hunting grounds. Can you work out how to get back to your home from here? Asked Hiccup, consulting the ticking thing anxiously. And take us back to Berk when you've got there. The scary white wilderness all around them seemed an unlikely sort of home to Hiccup, but there was a happy glint in Bear Cub's grandmother's wild eyes, although she tried to hide it. She breathed in the air as cold as needles and peered through the mist, as if looking at something very familiar. She nodded. A wanderer is never lost, she said. We don't need that silly little bauble of yours to take us home. I could have showed that ridiculous Viking with the axe the way to America if he'd had the intelligence to ask me. Hiccup tried to organise launching the landing boats in a quiet sort of way, which was impossible, and Hiccup hopped from foot to foot in anxiety as the hysterical warriors mumbled in their sleeps with every crash of the oars. They were heavily armed with swords and wicked axes and every sort of dagger, and Bear Cub's grandmother did have a point. Hiccup had no doubt that if awoken they would deal out death with a vengeance. But it seemed that luck was with the escapers. The 7 landing boats plopped into the water without any of the hysterics opening their eyes. The Wanderers filled the boats, and the first boats began to row through the mist. Bear Cub's grandmother stood, standing up straight and tall at the front, pointing the way with one outstretched arm. The last landing boat had filled up, apart from Hiccup, Fishlegs and Kamikaze. Fishlegs was watching Hiccup as Hiccup got ready to climb down over the rim of the American Dream 2 and onto the last landing boat. There were flat icebergs very close to the left and right of them. Kamikaze had taken over from the snoring Red Ronald and was steering the American Dream 2, making sure that the ship was moving forward in a straight line so that it didn't bump into the icebergs. She had tied the slumbering Stormfly to her chest, and the little fat dragon suddenly stirred violently in her sleep, jogging Kamikaze's arm on the steering wheel. The American Dream 2 swerved suddenly and violently to the left, just as Hiccup was dangling over the edge on a rope, preparing to let himself drop into the little boat filled with wanderers below. "Whoa!" gasped Hiccup as the rope swung him forward, leaving the landing boat behind. "Watch where you're going, Kamikaze!" But Stormfly seemed to be having some sort of nightmare and was squirming around wildly, so that Kamikaze was struggling to see over her wriggling tail as it flapped in Kamikaze's face. In those vital seconds, the American Dream 2 careered erratically forward, glancing off an iceberg to the left before Stormfly settled down and Kamikaze got the boat under control again. In the meantime, when the boat hit the iceberg, Hiccup had lost his grip on the rope he was dangling from and plunged downward. And the next chapter is called Run! Oh dear. I'll just read you the first sentence. And he landed rather painfully on his bottom, right in the middle of a circle of polar serpents. Uh-oh.